The morning sunlight poured through the thin curtains of Emily's bedroom, painting the walls with streaks of golden warmth. She lay in bed a few minutes longer than usual, staring at the ceiling as the faint sound of Mark's electric razor hummed from the bathroom. This was the soundtrack of her mornings now, predictable, routine, and devoid of surprises. She sighed and threw off the comforter, forcing herself to begin another day. In the kitchen, Mark was already at the table, reading the news on his tablet. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the room, but it did little to lift Emily's spirits. She poured herself a cup, leaning against the counter for a moment before sitting across from him. "Morning," she said, attempting a smile. "Morning," he replied, not looking up. Their conversations had dwindled to this, brief exchanges, more out of habit than genuine connection. Emily studied him as he scrolled through his tablet, his brow furrowed in concentration. His hair was starting to gray at the temples, and though he still had the same strong jawline she'd fallen for years ago, there was a weight to his demeanor now. She wasn't sure if it was age, stress, or simply the wear of life. "Anything interesting?" she asked, nodding toward the screen. "Just the usual nonsense," Mark said. "Politics, stock market updates, more layoffs in tech." Emily nodded absently, taking a sip of her coffee. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was almost time to head to her book club, the one thing she still looked forward to every week. It wasn't so much the books, though she enjoyed reading, but the chance to get out of the house and feel like her own person for a while. "I'm heading to book club this afternoon," she said, hoping for some acknowledgement. "Okay," Mark said without looking up. "You'll be back for dinner, right?" "Yes," she said, biting back the urge to snap at him. Of course she would be back for dinner. She was always back for dinner. She had spent years bending her life to fit around his schedule, his needs. What did he think she'd do? Run off and abandon him? The thought lingered in her mind longer than it should have. Later, as Emily slipped on her jacket and grabbed her bag, she realized she was running late. Her car was in the shop, and she had planned to walk, but now that didn't seem like an option. She pulled out her phone and opened the Uber app, quickly requesting a ride. Within minutes, a notification popped up. Jake would be arriving in a silver sedan. She stepped outside just as the car pulled up. The driver rolled down the window and gave her a warm smile. He was younger than she'd expected, probably mid-30s, with messy brown hair and a scruffy beard that somehow managed to look intentional. His eyes were a striking hazel, the kind that caught the sunlight and seemed to change color. "Emily?" he asked, his voice smooth and confident. "That's me," she said, climbing into the back seat. Jake glanced at her in the rearview mirror as she buckled her seatbelt. "Headed to the community center?" "Yes, thank you." The car began to move, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Emily gazed out the window, watching the familiar streets pass by. But Jake's voice broke the silence, pulling her attention back. "Heeding to something fun?" he asked. "Book club," she replied with a small smile, not sure if that qualifies as fun. "Depends on the book," Jake said, grinning. "Let me guess. Something serious, like a crime thriller." "Close," Emily said. "Historical fiction this time. It's about World War II. "Ah, a classic choice," Jake said. "I always admire people who make time to read. Most of my passengers just scroll through their phones the whole ride." Emily chuckled. "Guilty as charged, but book club forces me to actually finish something." Their conversation flowed easily, and Emily found herself smiling more than she had in days. There was something disarming about Jake, his relaxed demeanor, the way he genuinely seemed interested in what she had to say. She couldn't remember the last time a stranger had made her feel this seen. As they pulled into the community center parking lot, Jake glanced at her in the mirror again. "Enjoy your book club. And hey, maybe next time you'll convince me to give historical fiction a try." Emily laughed softly. "I'll keep that in mind." She stepped out of the car and waved as Jake drove off. For a moment, she stood there, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. It was silly, really, a harmless conversation with a stranger. And yet, as she walked into the building, she realized she was still smiling. The book club meeting was uneventful, as usual. The discussion meandered from the book to politics to the latest neighborhood gossip. Emily participated just enough to be polite, but her mind kept drifting back to Jake. She replayed their conversation in her head, marveling at how easy it had been. He had a way of making her feel interesting. Not just a wife or a homemaker, but a person with stories worth sharing. By the time she got home that evening, Mark was already in his usual spot on the couch, watching the news. He barely glanced up as she walked in. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she replied, setting her bag down. "How's book club?" he asked, his eyes still fixed on the screen. "It was fine," she said, sitting down across from him. She waited for him to ask more, to show some interest, but the moment passed, and the silence stretched between them. Emily leaned back against the couch, her thoughts drifting once again to Jake. It was absurd, really. He was just an Uber driver, someone she'd talked to for all of 10 minutes. But the way he'd looked at her, the way he'd listened, it had sparked something she hadn't felt in years. Restlessness, curiosity, a quiet, dangerous longing for more. The following week passed in its usual monotony. Emily moved through her daily routines like clockwork: coffee in the morning, errands in the afternoon, cooking dinner while Mark remained buried in his tablet or glued to the TV. Their conversations were short, predictable, and devoid of any real depth. By the time the weekend rolled around, Emily found herself craving another escape. She didn't realize how much she was hoping for Jake to reappear until she booked an Uber to go downtown for an afternoon shopping trip. She had no expectation of seeing him again, but the thought lingered at the back of her mind as the app pinged with a driver notification. When she saw his name, Jake, and the same silver sedan, a small thrill ran through her. Jake pulled up to the curb, his signature easy smile already in place. "Emily," he greeted, leaning slightly toward the passenger side window. "Back so soon?" Emily couldn't help but laugh. "I promise I'm not stalking you." "Good," he replied with a playful wink, "because I'd make a terrible victim." She climbed into the car, already feeling more relaxed than she had all week. The familiarity of his presence and the banter they'd fallen into so naturally last time felt like a balm. Jake pulled back onto the road, and for the first few minutes the conversation stayed light. Small talk about the weather, the upcoming holidays, and how busy the city center was likely to be. Then Jake asked a question that caught her off guard. "So, are you and your husband still debating historical fiction versus thrillers?" Emily blinked, momentarily surprised he'd remembered such a small detail from their last conversation. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the seam of her handbag. "Not exactly," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "We don't really debate much of anything these days." Jake glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. "That sounds quiet." "It is," Emily admitted, her voice softer now. She didn't know why she was telling him this. She barely knew him, and yet it felt easier to confide in Jake than to admit these truths to herself. Quiet can be good, though, right? Sometimes, Jake said carefully, but sometimes it just means no one's saying what needs to be said. Emily looked out the window, her heart tightening at the truth in his words. She had stopped saying what needed to be said years ago, afraid of where those conversations might lead. The silence in her marriage had grown like ivy, wrapping itself around everything until there was no room left to breathe. Jake didn't press her further, and for that she was grateful. Instead, he shifted the conversation back to lighter topics, making her laugh with stories about his more eccentric passengers. By the time they reached her destination, Emily felt lighter. The weight of her unspoken thoughts momentarily lifted. "Thanks for the ride," she said as she stepped out. "And for the conversation." "Any time," Jake replied. His smile lingered as she closed the door. The rides with Jake became a pattern Emily told herself was accidental at first. Her car remained in the shop longer than expected, and she justified needing an Uber for her errands and social outings. But deep down, she knew she was timing her requests during hours she thought Jake might be working, and more often than not, he was the one who showed up. Each ride felt like an indulgence, a small escape from the monotony of her daily life. With Jake, the conversations flowed effortlessly. He asked questions that made her feel seen, and he remembered the small details she shared. His laugh was warm and unguarded, and the way he looked at her, really looked at her, made her heart race in a way it hadn't in years. It wasn't just the conversations, though. It was the way he seemed genuinely interested in her answers, how his eyes softened when she talked about her childhood memories or her favorite books. It was the way he made her feel alive, like she was more than just a wife going through the motions of a stagnant marriage. One afternoon, as Jake pulled into her driveway after yet another ride, he turned in his seat and said, "You know, I'm starting to think you're my favorite passenger." Emily laughed, though her cheeks warmed at the compliment. "Well, you're certainly my favorite driver." "I'll take it," Jake said, his grin widening, "even if it's just because I have good taste in music." She rolled her eyes, pointing at his dashboard where a classic rock playlist was playing. "Good taste is debatable." "Debatable?" Jake leaned slightly toward her, his voice low and teasing. "I guess I'll just have to win you over." The air between them shifted, growing heavier, though neither of them acknowledged it. Emily felt the tension humming beneath the surface, a mix of exhilaration and guilt tightening in her chest. She quickly unbuckled her seatbelt and reached for the door handle. "Ah, thanks for the ride," she said, her voice a touch too bright. "See you around." Jake nodded, his gaze lingering on her just a moment too long. "Take care, Emily." As she stepped inside her house, Emily leaned against the closed door, her heart pounding. She told herself it was harmless, just friendly banter, but the way her pulse raced whenever she saw Jake, the way her thoughts lingered on him long after their rides, told a different story. A week later, Jake offered to take a scenic route home, suggesting it might be a nice change of pace. Emily agreed, curious and eager to prolong their time together. They drove along the edge of a wooded park, the autumn leaves painting the world in shades of red and gold. Jake rolled down the windows slightly, letting the crisp air fill the car. "It's beautiful out here," Emily said, her voice almost a whisper. Jake glanced at her, his eyes soft. "It is, but not as beautiful as—" He stopped himself, shaking his head with a sheepish smile. "Never mind." Emily felt her cheeks flush, but she didn't press him. Instead, she let the silence stretch, filled only by the sound of the wind and the distant rustle of leaves. The moment felt fragile, like it could shatter if either of them spoke. When Jake finally pulled into her driveway, he hesitated before unlocking the doors. "Emily," he said, his voice low, "can I ask you something?" She turned to him, her breath catching at the intensity in his gaze. "What is it?" "Are you happy?" he asked, his words cutting through the air like a knife. Emily froze, the weight of the question pressing down on her. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The truth sat heavy in her chest, unspoken but undeniable. Jake didn't push her for an answer. He simply nodded, his expression understanding, yet unreadable. "Take care," he said again, his voice softer this time. As Emily stepped inside, she realized she couldn't stop trembling. The question lingered, echoing in her mind long after Jake had driven away, and for the first time in years, she wasn't sure how to answer it. Emily spent the next few days grappling with Jake's question. "Are you happy?" It wasn't the first time the thought had crossed her mind, but coming from him, it felt heavier, more urgent. The question lingered in her mind like a whisper she couldn't ignore, weaving itself into every corner of her day. She'd watch Mark at the dinner table, absorbed in his tablet, and wonder if he even cared to know the answer. Jake had become more than just a fleeting distraction. He was a catalyst for emotions Emily hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She knew it was dangerous to keep booking rides with him, but a part of her craved the way he made her feel, alive, interesting, seen. And so, one late afternoon, she opened the Uber app again, her fingers hesitating for only a moment before confirming the ride. When Jake's silver sedan pulled up to her driveway, she felt her pulse quicken. He rolled down the window and grinned, as if they were old friends, rather than driver and passenger. "Hey, stranger," he said. "You again. You must think I don't own a car," Emily joked as she climbed into the back seat. "I don't mind," Jake replied, his voice warm. "You're good company." His words sent a ripple of warmth through her, and for a moment she forgot to feel guilty. They chatted as they drove, their conversation flowing as naturally as ever. But today, there was an undercurrent to their interactions, a quiet intensity that neither of them addressed. As they approached her destination, a quiet cafe she liked downtown, Jake glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "You know," he said, almost hesitantly, "I'm off after this ride. If you don't mind the company, I could use a coffee." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She hesitated, torn between the logical voice in her head telling her to decline and the thrill of saying yes. "I wouldn't mind," she said finally, her voice soft. Jake smiled, pulling into a parking spot near the cafe. He opened the car door for her, a small gesture that felt oddly intimate. Inside, they chose a quiet table by the window. The cafe was cozy and warm, the scent of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. Emily wrapped her hands around her cup, the warmth grounding her as she tried to ignore the butterflies in her stomach. "So," Jake said, leaning back in his chair, "tell me something about yourself I wouldn't guess." Emily laughed softly, the question catching her off guard. "That's a tough one. I feel like I'm pretty predictable." "I don't buy that for a second," Jake said, his hazel eyes locked on hers. "There's more to you than you let on." Emily felt her cheeks flush under his gaze. "Okay," she said, taking a sip of her coffee. "When I was a kid, I wanted to be a dancer. Ballet, specifically. Jake's eyebrows lifted. Really? What happened? Life, Emily said with a shrug. My parents thought it was impractical. Then college happened, then work, then marriage. You know how it goes. Jake nodded, his expression thoughtful. Do you ever miss it? Sometimes, Emily admitted, but it feels like a lifetime ago. I don't even think about it much anymore. You should, Jake said, his voice soft but firm. It's never too late to do something you love. The sincerity in his tone took Emily by surprise. She felt an unfamiliar pang of longing, a reminder of dreams she had buried long ago. What about you? She asked, steering the conversation away from herself. What's something I wouldn't guess about you? Jake smiled, a touch of sadness flickering in his eyes. I used to be a teacher, high school English. Emily blinked, surprised. Really? What happened? Life. Jake echoed her earlier words, though his tone carried a heavier weight. Life. Divorce. Burnout. Driving lets me clear my head. It's not glamorous, but it's simple. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared confession settling between them. Emily felt a strange connection to Jake, as if he understood her in ways Mark never had. It was a dangerous thought, one she quickly pushed aside. As they left the cafe, Jake walked her back to his car. The sun was setting, casting the sky in hues of pink and gold. Emily paused before getting into the car, the moment stretching out as Jake turned to face her. Emily, he said, his voice low, I don't want to overstep, but I feel like there's something between us. Her breath caught in her throat. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, she looked away, her heart pounding. She couldn't deny the truth in his words, but admitting it felt like crossing a line she wasn't ready to face. I should get home, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded, his expression unreadable. He opened the door for her without another word, the silence between them heavy, as they drove back to her house. When they arrived, Jake parked the car but didn't unlock the doors immediately. Emily, he said quietly, his gaze meeting hers in the rearview mirror. I'm not trying to make things harder for you, but I can't pretend I don't feel something when I'm around you. Emily felt her chest tighten, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She didn't know what to say, how to reconcile the pull she felt toward Jake with the life she had built with Mark. I don't know what to do with that, she admitted, her voice trembling. Jake nodded, his expression softening. I get it. Just take care of yourself, okay? As Emily stepped out of the car and walked toward her front door, she felt an ache she couldn't quite place. The boundary between her and Jake had shifted, and she knew things would never be the same. Inside, Mark was waiting in the living room, his face illuminated by the glow of the TV. How was your day? He asked, glancing at her briefly before turning back to the screen. Fine, Emily said, her voice hollow. She sat down beside him, her mind still with Jake, the memory of his words lingering like a whisper she couldn't escape. The days following her coffee with Jake felt like a haze. Emily moved through her routines as if on autopilot, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She couldn't shake the memory of Jake's words, or the intensity in his eyes as he told her he felt something between them. She knew she should stop seeing him, stop booking rides, but every time she thought about it, a hollow ache settled in her chest. It was on a Wednesday afternoon when she found herself opening the Uber app again. Her car was ready for pickup at the mechanic's, and she knew this could be the perfect excuse to see Jake one last time. She told herself it would be the final ride, the closure she needed to move on. When Jake's name popped up as the assigned driver, a mix of relief and trepidation washed over her. His car pulled up minutes later, and he greeted her with his usual warm smile, though there was a hint of hesitation in his eyes. "Back to the mechanic?" Jake asked as she climbed in. Emily nodded, forcing a casual tone. "Yep, finally getting my car back." Jake smiled faintly, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he pulled away from the curb. They drove in silence for the first few minutes, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. Emily stared out the window, trying to think of something to say, but her thoughts were a tangle of emotions. "I'm glad I got this ride," Jake said, suddenly breaking the silence. His voice was quiet, almost tentative. "I wasn't sure if I'd see you again." Emily turned to look at him, her heart pounding. "Why would you think that?" Jake glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his hazel eyes searching hers. "Because I told you how I felt, and I know that's not fair to you." She swallowed hard, her chest tightening. "It's not that simple, Jake." "I know," he said softly, "but I meant what I said. I feel something when I'm with you, and I don't think I can ignore it." Emily looked away, her gaze falling to her hands in her lap. "You don't know me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not really." Jake chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "Maybe not, but I know how you make me feel, and I know that you're not happy." His words struck a nerve, and Emily felt her defenses crumble. She looked up, meeting his gaze in the mirror. "You don't get to make that call." Jake pulled the car over to the side of the road, cutting the engine. The sudden stillness made Emily's pulse race. He turned to face her, his expression a mix of frustration and vulnerability. "Then tell me I'm wrong," he said, his voice steady but low. "Tell me you're happy, and I'll let it go." Emily opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. She couldn't lie to him, not when he was looking at her like that, his eyes filled with a raw intensity that left her breathless. Jake sighed, leaning back in his seat. "I'm not trying to complicate your life, Emily. I can't stop thinking about you." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and unshakable. Emily's heart raced as she tried to process what he was saying, what it meant for her. She wanted to say something, anything, but all she could do was stare at him, her thoughts a chaotic mess. Without thinking, she reached out, her hand brushing his arm. Jake froze at the contact, his eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, neither of them moved, the tension between them crackling like electricity. Then, slowly, Jake leaned toward her. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Emily's breath hitched as she closed the distance between them. "I can't," she whispered. Their lips met in a kiss that was both hesitant and urgent, a culmination of weeks of unspoken tension. Emily felt a surge of emotions, relief, exhilaration, and guilt all at once. Jake's hand cupped her cheek, his touch gentle but firm, grounding her in the moment. When they finally pulled apart, Jake rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. "Emily," he said, his voice filled with longing and uncertainty. "What are we doing?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling, "but I can't seem to stop." Jake nodded, his thumb brushing against her cheek. "Me neither." They sat there for a few moments, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. Emily knew she should feel more guilt, but all she could think about was how alive she felt. How long it had been since she'd felt anything this real. "We should go," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded, starting the engine. The rest of the ride was silent, but the air between them buzzed with unspoken emotions. When they reached the mechanic, Jake parked and turned to her, his expression a mix of sadness and resolve. "Emily," he said, softly, "I don't want to make things harder for you, but I also don't want to pretend this didn't happen." She nodded, her chest tightening. "I know." "Take care of yourself," Jake said, his voice steady but gentle. Emily stepped out of the car, her legs feeling unsteady. She watched as Jake drove away, the silver sedan disappearing down the street. For a moment she stood there, unsure of what to do next. The kiss had changed everything, and she knew there was no going back to the way things were. As she drove home in her newly repaired car, her thoughts were consumed by Jake. His touch, his words, the way he made her feel. But beneath the exhilaration, a flicker of dread began to grow. She had crossed a line, and she wasn't sure how she would face the consequences. The days following the kiss were a blur of guilt and longing. Emily threw herself into her daily routines, hoping that the monotony of cleaning, errands, and cooking would help her forget. But it didn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she could feel Jake's lips on hers, his hand on her cheek, the intensity in his gaze as he whispered her name. At home, Mark remained as oblivious as ever. He barely glanced up from his tablet during dinner, his conversations mechanical and brief. Emily found herself watching him more closely, searching for any signs that he might suspect something. But there were none. The guilt gnawed at her, but so did a growing resentment. How had they let their marriage slip into this state of quiet indifference? One evening, as they sat on the couch watching the news, Mark turned to her suddenly. "You've been distracted lately," he said, his tone casual but probing. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She forced a smile, keeping her voice light. "Just busy, the usual." Mark nodded, his eyes lingering on her for a moment before turning back to the TV. "If something's bothering you, you can talk to me, you know." The statement hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Emily opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, she nodded silently, the guilt twisting in her chest like a knife. She couldn't bring herself to tell him the truth. Not now. Not ever. Emily's resolve to stay away from Jake lasted exactly 5 days. On the 6th, she found herself opening the Uber app again, her heart pounding as she waited to see if his name would appear. When it did, a mix of relief and anxiety swept over her. Jake pulled up to her driveway a few minutes later, his expression unreadable, as she climbed into the car. "Emily," he said softly, his tone a mix of surprise and caution. "I didn't think I'd see you again." "I wasn't sure I'd see you either," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I couldn't stop thinking about you." Jake glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his hazel eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name. Neither could I. The ride was silent for a while, the tension between them palpable. Emily tried to focus on the passing scenery, but her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "This isn't fair to you," he said quietly, "or to me. We need to figure out what this is." "I know," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know how." Jake pulled the car over to the side of the road, turning to face her. Emily, I'm not asking you to make any decisions right now, but I can't keep doing this, not knowing where we stand. Emily looked away, her chest tightening. I don't know where we stand either, she admitted. All I know is that I feel something for you, something I haven't felt in years. Oh, Jake reached out, his hand brushing against hers. Oh, I feel it too, he said softly, but I don't want to hurt you or anyone else. His words sent a wave of guilt crashing over her, but they also filled her with a strange sense of comfort. Jake wasn't trying to pressure her or push her into anything. He just wanted clarity, something she couldn't seem to give him. I need time, she said finally, her voice trembling. I need to figure this out. Jake nodded, his expression somber but understanding. Take all the time you need. When Emily arrived home that evening, she found Mark waiting for her in the kitchen. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable. Where were you? He asked, his tone calm but laced with suspicion. Emily said, her voice steady, just running errands. Mark's eyes narrowed slightly. For 3 hours? Emily hesitated, her mind racing. I stopped for coffee, she said finally, and ran into an old friend. We got to talking. Mark stared at her for a long moment before nodding slowly. All right, he said. But if there's something you're not telling me, Emily, I'd appreciate it if you were honest. The statement sent a chill down her spine. She forced a smile, hoping it didn't look as strained as it felt. There's nothing to tell, Mark. He nodded again, but the tension between them lingered. Emily excused herself to the bathroom, her hands trembling as she splashed cold water on her face. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, her guilt etched into every line of her face. She couldn't keep doing this, not to Mark, not to herself, not to Jake. The breaking point came a week later. Emily had been careful, deleting texts, hiding receipts, and keeping her meetings with Jake brief and discreet. But all it took was one mistake. A crumpled coffee receipt from her last meeting with Jake, left carelessly in her purse. Mark found it while looking for loose change. What's this? He asked, holding up the receipt as Emily walked into the kitchen. Emily froze, her heart pounding. A receipt? She said, her voice too casual. What about it? Mark's jaw tightened. It's from a cafe across town, on a day when you said you were grocery shopping. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Are you seeing someone? Mark asked, his voice low and dangerous. No, Emily said quickly, her voice rising. It's not like that. Then what is it? Mark demanded, his eyes blazing. 'Cause from where I'm standing, it sure as hell looks like you've been lying to me. Emily's chest tightened, the weight of her deception crashing down on her. She wanted to tell him the truth, to lay everything bare, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Mark standing alone in the kitchen. As she sat in her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel, Emily felt a sob rising in her throat. She had reached a crossroads, and no matter which path she chose, someone was going to get hurt. Emily sat alone in her car, staring blankly at the steering wheel. Her chest felt heavy, as if the weight of her secrets had finally become unbearable. The image of Mark holding the receipt replayed in her mind, his hurt and suspicion etched into his face. She hadn't been able to say anything, and walking away felt like both a betrayal and a relief. She gripped the wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white. How had it come to this? How had she let herself unravel the life she'd spent so many years building? Yet, deep down, she knew. The connection with Jake had filled a void she hadn't even realized was there, but now it felt like that same connection was pulling everything apart. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Jake. "Jake, are you okay?" She stared at the screen, her heart pounding. She hadn't told him about the receipt, about Mark's growing suspicion, but it was like he could sense the turmoil brewing in her life. She hesitated before typing back. "Emily, I don't know." A moment later, his response came. "Jake, let me see you, just to talk." Emily swallowed hard. She knew she shouldn't. Meeting him would only complicate things further. But the thought of facing Mark right now felt impossible. Against her better judgment, she texted back. "Okay." Jake was waiting for her in his car at the edge of a quiet park, the fading light of dusk casting long shadows across the empty lot. As Emily pulled up beside him, she felt her chest tighten. She didn't know what she was going to say, only that she needed to see him to make sense of the storm raging inside her. She slid into the passenger seat of his car, her hands trembling slightly. Jake turned to her, his hazel eyes filled with concern. "You look like you've been through hell," he said softly. "I feel like I have," Emily admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't say anything, just reached out to gently brush a strand of hair from her face. His touch was warm, grounding, but it only made the ache in her chest deepen. "Mark found a receipt," she said finally, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "He's suspicious. I didn't tell him anything, but he knows something's not right." Jake sighed, leaning back in his seat. "Emily, you can't keep living like this. It's not fair. To you, to Mark, or to us." "I know," she said, tears welling in her eyes, "but I don't know what to do. I don't know how to fix this." "You can't fix it unless you're honest," Jake said gently. "With him and with yourself." Emily wiped at her eyes, her breath hitching. "And what about us? What do I even say to you?" Jake's jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked away. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with emotion. "I don't want to be the reason you destroy your marriage, but I also can't pretend I don't want more with you." His words hung in the air, and Emily felt her heart splinter. She wanted more with him too, but the thought of dismantling her life, the life she'd built with Mark, terrified her. "I can't leave him," she said finally, her voice trembling. "Not yet." Jake nodded, though his expression was pained. "Then you need to figure out what you want, because this, sneaking around, hiding, it's not sustainable." Emily nodded, knowing he was right, but the thought of making a choice felt paralyzing. She closed her eyes, leaning her head against the window as a single tear slid down her cheek. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was apologizing to, Jake, Mark, or herself. When Emily returned home, Mark was waiting in the living room. The TV was off, and the only light came from the lamp in the corner. He looked up as she walked in, his expression a mix of hurt and determination. "Emily," he said, his voice steady but firm, "we need to talk." She hesitated, her heart racing. "Mark, Sit down," he interrupted, gesturing to the couch across from him. Emily obeyed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Finally, Mark spoke. I know something's been going on, he said, his tone calm but unyielding. I don't know what, but I can feel it. And I need you to tell me the truth. Emily's chest tightened, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. For a moment she considered confessing everything. Jake, the rides, the kiss, but the thought of the pain it would cause made her hesitate. There's nothing to tell, she said finally, her voice weak. I've just been stressed. Mark's eyes narrowed slightly, and she could see the disbelief in his gaze. But he didn't push her. Instead, he leaned back, crossing his arms. If you're not ready to talk, fine. But I can't keep living like this, feeling like I'm losing you. His words hit her like a punch to the gut, and she felt the tears welling in her eyes. Again, she wanted to tell him it wasn't true, that he wasn't losing her. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. She had already started to slip away, and she didn't know how to stop. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. Mark nodded slowly, his expression softening. Me too. The conversation ended there, but the tension lingered, heavy and unresolved. As Emily lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she realized she was at a crossroads. She couldn't keep avoiding the truth, couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. She had to make a choice. But no matter which path she chose, she knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again.